and I'll be facilitating the discussion today. Welcome. As with our previous webinar, the intention is to promote interparliamentary dialogue among members on relevant issues related to the COVID pandemic. I'm pleased we have such high interest from members today, and of course also very pleased that we have two high-level expert speakers, the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities and the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you very much for your readiness to contribute to this discussion today. This discussion today is the 7th in a series of parliamentary web dialogues on the COVID pandemic and its fallout of areas of particular interest and priority for the OSCPA. In these discussions, we've aimed to discuss issues related to both political and security dimension, economic dimension, democracy and human rights. Of course, today we turn our attention to focus on social cohesion as a background of intolerance that the UN Secretary General has recently referred to as a tsunami of hate and xenophobia. I will let our guest speakers and members introduce today's discussion, but please allow me just to make a few technical comments. First of all, please note that the webinar is being recorded and broadcast live on Facebook. If you have any connection problems, please contact our team. We'll do whatever we can to help out. Their contact details should be put into the chat function now. We have 3 language interpretation into English, French, and Russian languages. Please note that listening to the interpretation requires a separate device. You should all have received information to connect to this Interpretify service. If not, please let us know in the chat function and we'll do what we can to get you connected. When we get to the discussion, we request that please all requests to take the floor are written into the webinar's chat function. And I will give you the floor during the debate then. To ensure a smooth process, we ask that everybody is muted unless you're actually, of course, taking the floor. And of course, we ask that people are please succinct in their comments when we get to that point. Without further ado, I will then move straight in because I know it's a big topic. So I'm pleased to ask OSCE Parliamentary Assembly President George Tsereteli to give a short welcome. Then it will be followed by Mr. Kyriakos Hagiani, the Chair of the Human Rights Committee. He'll say a few words to introduce the topic, and then the Secretary General, Mr. Roberto Montella, and our 2 speakers. Anybody that is interested to intervene, please, you can already from this point remark this in the chat function. So I now ask President Tsereteli to say a few words as an introduction. Thank you. Microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you or our colleagues for organizing this interesting and important event. I'd like to greet all my friends and colleagues here, especially our friends from US and Canada. Transatlantic relations are important, and all of you who are tuned in. It's very clear that COVID's impact is not simply one of harming our physical health only. And I'm pleased that our assembly is a place when we can address these larger social issues. I'm also proud that issues related to combating intolerance and discrimination are a regular part of OSCE discussions. As with so many other aspects of our lives, COVID has amplified these challenges. And I'm hopeful, however, that we can also use this as an opportunity to intensify our efforts to address these challenges. To do so, we should all be encouraging our parliaments and governments to take the social and psychological aspects of this disease very seriously. And I'm pleased that the network of parliamentarians in our assembly are stepping up to the challenge, all these troubles and challenges, addressing these difficult issues head on. This is a time when such leadership has an increased potential to have real and lasting change for our societies. So I'd like to greet and thank our 2 distinguished speakers for taking time to share their expertise with us. Today, Ambassador Zanier, our old friend and the former Secretary General of this Assembly and a great partner. So always happy to see you, dear Lamberto. And of course, Ms. Nada Al-Rashid, as a Deputy United Nations of Human Rights, and we're really delighted to continue this cooperation we started with Dr. Bachelet at our meeting earlier this year. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, President Tsereteli. I'll now give the floor to the chair of our Human Rights Committee, Mr. Kyriakos Hagiani from Cyprus, to say a few words to the topic of discussion today.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you very much to everybody. I wish to all of you a fruitful discussion in this today's seminar. We have no doubt the all seen indication that the COVID pandemic is impacting different groups in different ways. So I hope that our discussion today can contribute to a more complete understanding of the problem. The World Health Organization has specifically advocated for taking a human rights lens to addressing COVID based particularly on two aspects. First, economic and social circumstances have a significant impact on people's vulnerability and the spread of the disease. Basically, the disease is making existing social and economic divisions more extreme. Second, the WHO confirms that there is a long history of public health emergencies leading to stigma and discrimination. We are often afraid of the unknown, and it is easy to associate that fear with others. The COVID pandemic is no exception to this. It may be too soon for complete data, but it seems undeniable that there has been an increase in online activity of discriminatory nature. Depending upon the location, I have seen indications of 20% to 200% increases in online traffic to hate sites. Police departments have similarly reported spikes in hate-based incidents, particularly towards victims of Asian ethnicity. We should all recognize that at a time of such stress as this pandemic is causing, we must continue to be sensitive about how we express our thoughts and concerns. For example, while it may be an instinctive response to want to condemn people that appear to be disregarding social distancing rules, it can be dangerous to associate this with particular groups. Such comments can quickly be turned into scapegoating of minorities and feed intolerance and long-existing discrimination. As public officials, we have a particular duty to speak out against intolerance and to work in favor of social cohesion. As you may recall, last year we passed a declaration calling on all of us to create a coalition of respect by publicly speaking out against hate speech and other manifestations of intolerance. Now is the time to deliver. I'm very pleased that our two expert speakers have taken the time to join us today and to help us understand the challenges involved, as well as, I hope, help us find constructive ways forward to build more inclusive and resilient societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hagiani. I'll now ask our Secretary General, Mr. Roberto Montella, if you would like to intervene and welcome participants.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and congratulations to you and all the team for putting up this very good webinar. I also would like to welcome our guest speakers today, Ms. Gif. Thank you very much for participating, and Ambassador Lamberto Zanier. In the OSCE region, as you all know, there are still areas subject to tensions involving minorities, and COVID can actually exacerbate them, which is what has been happening in the US. And of course, I look forward to hearing from Senator Ben Cardin. In this regard, also, I would like to thank Ambassador Lamberto Zanier, who has visited the minorities when he could still travel. I hope he will resume to do that soon. But also by remote, he has talked a lot to minorities, and I look forward also, Ambassador Zanier, to listen to your specific recommendations that you've issued during this COVID, specific recommendation on COVID. Parliamentarians are the network between the public and the institutions, but especially those who belong to minorities have a particular added value, and our assembly has many representatives of minorities in our midst, so we very much value them. I am particularly pleased because I see in this webinar we don't have only the President greeted two guests from North America and the US. I'd like also to welcome the guests from east of Vienna. I see here from the Council of Federation, Ms. Inna Svitenko, and Vladimir Jabarov, who, by the way, comes from Samarkand, Uzbekistan. So we also have minorities within the Russian Federation delegation. But minorities and social cohesion is a topic very important to me. I've worked for many years in the Balkans, in southern Serbia, and this is an issue that I particularly appreciate. Just a note, a footnote, yesterday there were elections in Serbia where a big part of the political parties in Serbia boycotted the elections, but the minorities did not boycott the elections. So for once, I mean, in the past, the minorities used to boycott. Now they have not boycotted, and there is a big representation of minorities in this new parliament. So we welcome that. But I don't want to take too much of your time. I think we are about 82 participants, 30 from 30 countries, and many MPs participating. So I look forward to listening and to learning new things from Ambassador Zanier and Ms. Najib. Thank you very much, Andreas, and good work to all of us.
Thank you, Secretary General. With that, I'll then move to introducing our two high-level speakers, whose contributions I'm sure will be invaluable. We will hear first today from a familiar friend for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the High Commissioner on National Minorities, Ambassador Lamberto Zanier. As most of you will know, the High Commissioner works to de-escalate tensions involving national minorities within the OSCE area. I hope you've all had an opportunity to examine some of the measures that his office has outlined relating to promoting social cohesion within this current context. In any event, I'm sure he'll discuss some of that. Within the OSCE, Ambassador Zanier needs little introduction, having previously served as Director of the Conflict Prevention Center and then also as Secretary General for 6 years. Ambassador Zanier also brings extensive experience as a career diplomat in his home Italy, as well as having served as UN Special Representative and head of the UN Interim Administration in mission in Kosovo. Ambassador Zanier, please, you have the floor. I think your microphone is off, Ambassador Zanier.
Try again. Thank you. So
that sounds
good afternoon. Thank you, Andreas. Good afternoon, everybody. And I would like to thank in particular President Serreteli, Secretary General Montella, and Chairman Hadjiannis for their kind introduction, but also for offering us the space for this interaction, which I find very important because there are two angles in it. One, to increase awareness of some of the problems we see, and secondly, also to provide some advice and some recommendations on how to address the problem. So what we have seen at the beginning of COVID is, in fact, an increase of hate-based incidents of discrimination, and basically what we have seen is that pandemics have become a factor which has exposed shortcomings in mainstreaming diversity in policies and services in diverse societies in general, and also in highlighted deeply rooted inequalities in the society, even more than that is usually the case. And one of the things I also notice is that it becomes really difficult to separate at this point national minorities from other groups, vulnerable groups within the society, because they're all equally targeted beyond the definitions and beyond how participating states call them. So this has to do with trying to protect those that have become more exposed because of the pandemic, and the areas that we have identified, areas where we have seen these vulnerabilities, in fact, largely coincide with the areas where my office has already traditionally issued recommendations. So the areas of attention and the weaknesses in policies of integration of diverse societies. So I have also presented a report recently to the Permanent Council on this and other aspects of my work. But I've also issued an ad hoc set of recommendations, as you mentioned, Andrea, on streamlining diversity and highlighting COVID-19 measures that support the social cohesion. And we started off with some basic principles. First of all, highlighting the need to uphold human rights in every response to the pandemics, but also inclusiveness. This is time when communities need to come together, recognizing, however, their diversities and recognizing the fact that some may be exposed more than others. So looking around, and I have to say, one problem we had was to collect data and to collect information, because of course COVID also affected the way we operate ourselves. So I couldn't travel as I usually do, so I had to rely on multiple different sources, information from open sources and the media, information from other parts of other organizations that have similar mandate to mine. Information that we gather from groups on the ground, NGOs or representatives of minorities themselves. But certainly this is an area where I intend, and actually I will have soon also a webinar with participating states, where I will request participating states also to activate themselves and to provide directly to us a bit more information on how they're handling and where they find difficulties. So this could be a beginning of that. And it would be useful also to hear from you, from your own perspectives, where you think and where you see that there are challenges and where we also, the basis of our respective mandate, myself, Odir, and the other institutions of the OSCE, where we can intervene and address problematic areas that have emerged during the pandemics. So let's say at first glance, and looking at the situation, we have identified a number of sectors, areas that need to be kept, under constant monitoring. And the first of all, of course, is discrimination and hate speech, and we have seen groups targeted. Someone mentioned Asian groups. We have seen the Roma communities in many places blamed for in a way contributing to transmitting, to disseminating the pandemics, and other groups. Tendentially, it's always the minority groups that tend to be blamed for these factors. So it is important, and we have seen cases where authorities have intervened. We have seen, for instance, in Georgia, given President Tsereteli is with us, we have seen that the ministry and the minister for civic affairs and reintegration that has intervened to stop a campaign on Facebook against a local Azeri community, because there were cases there and there was the impression that this Azeri community was contributing to spreading the virus in its region. And of course the campaign started especially against a few individuals, and the ministry intervened to defend them and to blaming those who mounted this campaign. But certainly social media are one of the key tools for these incidents. In terms of other specific areas, where we've seen discrimination is, first of all, on access to health. Often minority communities are marginalized. They don't have the same degree of access to health. In some cases, they don't have the medical insurance, so the ability, in fact, to have access to treatment as others. And this in itself is a factor of discrimination. And what we saw and what we hear is that the fatalities within these communities, the percentage tends to be higher. This being one of the reasons. There are other factors, of course. Usually these communities are are not well off as majorities. So you see problems with the housing. You have a higher aggregation of multi-generational also presences in restricted spaces. We see also that there is culturally difficulty to social distance each other. This was actually one of the problems that we noticed within the Roma communities, where particular campaigns had to be made to try to encourage them to keep the distance. But of course, how can I say, the constraints and the logistic constraints for them were such that it was really difficult to achieve. So these are some, and then of course the fact that sometimes they had difficulty in understanding what needed to be done, because many countries reached out with information. The call centers that were set up were only in the state language, and so there are places where there are communities that speak different languages. They are not fully knowledgeable when it comes to the state language, and therefore the information that was given out was not really entirely effective or was not well understood. So these were some of the problems that we saw, and the role of the media. We saw also good examples. In Estonia, to give you an example, we've seen an appeal from the government to journalists of different ethnic backgrounds to disseminate information in their own mother tongues. So that was a rather spontaneous process, but which worked, because the information flow was reaching every community in the country, and so there was a good understanding of the policies, the recommendations of what needed to be done if anybody was affected. Another area of attention has to do with security. Some communities have been targeted disproportionately by the police in particular. And again, the Roma communities, in some OSCE countries, these communities have been forcibly isolated. Barriers have been built, monitoring of the health of these people, including via drone-based technology. So with unmanned aerial, and without their consent, of course. So they were subjected to medical scrutiny in a way forcibly, which of course I can understand that there may be a need of that, but this could happen in a different way. And then of course we saw on the always on the side of the vulnerability, the fact that some of the members of these minority communities were the ones that were serving on the front lines, both in the health service area or in the transport areas, or in providing basic services in fields where really there was no possibility of a lockdown. Because these services had to continue being offered to the public, and often it's the more vulnerable sides, parts of the society that are engaged in offering these services. And so because of that, they were also affected more than other parts of the society. Economically, they were also affected because of the areas where they were engaged. For instance, some minorities are located in proximity of borders, and so the closure of borders often reduced or completely blocked their outlets of their ability to continue operating. So closure of markets, but closure of borders also meant that the export to neighboring countries, and very often it's the cross-border trade, the kind of economic activity in which they traditionally engage, suffered massively from the closure of borders. Frontline workers couldn't continue operating. export of agricultural products, and often many of these people were and are engaged in the agricultural sector, and more broadly the informal economy, where there isn't even much transparency, but where we have seen that things have come to a halt, and there is no social protection for these people once their working activities are terminated. We also saw in the area of education that our recommendations are going in the direction of establishing a balance between teaching the state language and teaching the minority language for the minorities. In many cases, only the teaching of the state language continued on the basis of online platforms, and there wasn't the same investment and the same degree of attention, with many exceptions, of course. Also here, one cannot generalize. But in many cases, minority language education suffered, and it became a lesser priority. And of course, we started then getting signals that the minority communities were getting concerned. This especially because of the protracted time of the crisis. So in the recommendations that we issued, I won't go through them now because there are so many points that we raise, but we in fact try to identify the problematic areas and to advise on the way forward. Certainly a key area is the economic inclusion. It's important now that we approach, hopefully, a recovery phase. Let's hope we're not facing a second wave of the pandemics. And most likely we will all face a difficult phase and possibly a long recovery phase. We will there is a risk that the representatives of minorities will be the first victims, that they will continue to suffer from this situation. I think that there is a need for corrective measures to ensure that they are not penalized even beyond what they've been penalized already. And so, you know, you can have many ways of addressing this, the fiscal policies, for instance, and more broadly employment policies. And one final word about women. Women have been very often penalized twice because they belong to minority groups, but also because they're women within those groups, and they often face an accumulation of tasks, including looking after the kids who couldn't go to school, and so the domestic side, in addition to whatever other activity, but also women as victims of domestic violence. And we've seen a sharp increase of that once the freedom of movement was limited and they were forced in their households. And this is something that on which there should be awareness, and there should be a vigorous pushback from the international community and from the governments with ad hoc measures to address this. Thank you very much. I will conclude my remarks, and then if there are questions, I'll be happy to interact with the parliamentarians.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zanier. I think we'll move directly then to our next speaker, who is Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, who was appointed United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights in December last year. An economist and development practitioner, she brings to the role close to 30 years of experience within the UN system around the world. Particularly regarding our discussion today, I'd like to highlight Ms. Al-Nashif's recent work at UNESCO, leading a portfolio that targeted mobilization of knowledge for inclusive, just, and sustainable societies. Ms. Al-Nashif, welcome. Good afternoon. We look forward to hearing your perspective and benefiting from your expertise. I'd just like to note, I understand that you have other commitments and will have to be leaving in about half an hour at 4 o'clock, but we understand it's busy days. We appreciate your taking the time. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Baker, dear Mr. President, distinguished members of the Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you very much for having us here, and I do regret I have to leave. We are in between sessions of the Human Rights Council, all of which has been very complicated, of course, due to the circumstances. But it's fantastic to have the opportunity to speak to this distinguished group from across so many countries. And obviously, as the world's largest regional intergovernmental organization, the OSCE is a vital partner for our office across a wide range of issues. The President recalled the High Commissioner's visit on 20 February 2020 to your headquarters in Vienna. Much has changed since then, of course. I think that was her last mission before lockdown, but we have witnessed a very dramatic transformation in that period. If anything, I believe recent events have underscored the importance of a strengthened and effective cooperation between our entities. The legally binding UN human rights instruments and the politically binding OSCE human dimension commitments. These are mutually reinforcing. They must be sustained, expanded, and deepened, we believe. In that sense, I welcome that the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, jointly with the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, issued a press release on COVID-19, where they emphasized that, and I quote, governments must promote and protect access to and free flow of information during the pandemic. His Excellency Ambassador Zanier touched upon this, and I'll come back to it. But I think this need to fight against false information must remain at the forefront of our call for governments and internet companies to address this information. We're calling it the infodemic. And to provide reliable and verified information. Of course, this is directly relevant to what we're discussing today. The pandemic has revealed many systemic disparities resulting from marginalization, discrimination, racism, and xenophobia. As the High Commissioner noted, our High Commissioner, that is, noted on the 2nd of June, the rising disparities in how COVID-19 is affecting communities and the major disproportionate impact it is having on racial and ethnic minorities have exposed alarming inequalities within our societies. I will try not to repeat the excellent and very comprehensive overview of the ambassador, but I think just to add, in the OSCE region, we have noted numerous incidents of racism towards people of Chinese or Asian descent in the early stages of the pandemic. This was as it was being identified as a Chinese disease. Of course, this gradually evolved into a general attitude of xenophobia. The other, as has already been raised. And of course, COVID has been used as a justification for closing borders or taking harsher targeted measures against migrants and minorities and refugees. This issue of failure to provide information in minority languages has been a very difficult one, I think, making smaller minority groups even more vulnerable, since they often live in rural or remote areas where there is a lack of access to healthcare in any case. A report from the Fundamental Rights Agency on this issue, released in April, provided numerous indicative examples of verbal insults, harassment, physical aggression, online hate speech, targeting people with disabilities as well as refugees and migrants, nationals returning from abroad even, and minorities. Happily, the report also mentions some positive measures taken by authorities addressing hate speech. There was a case of a blogger, for example, in Latvia, who was arrested for highly inflammatory hate speech and charged with incitement to ethnic hatred. And I think this requires constant vigilance. Between January and April of this year, the European Network Against Racism documented 191 incidents of the impact of COVID on the fundamental rights of racialized groups in Europe, and found that nearly half of the incidents pertain to racist violence and racist hate speech and structural racism and police violence, about which we've heard a lot more in recent times. Obviously, new divisions have been created and existing ones have been accentuated. Women, again, as highlighted by the ambassador, have often borne the brunt. All women have been affected, but not equally, of course. If you are a minority or indigenous woman, woman with HIV, a woman in a conflict or humanitarian setting, adolescent girls, then the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities that were already very much in play. Data from the United Kingdom, for example, shows that Black women are 4.3 times more likely to die from COVID In the United States, Black people, the rate of death is 3 times the rate for white people. And according to the UN Women, our sister agency, 8.5 million migrant domestic workers who are women with insecure contracts are facing income loss and much greater risks of abuse and exploitation because they can't even return home. The above examples just point to the need to disaggregate testing data. I think this is something that we'd really like to make a call for, by race or ethnicity, so that we can have a really clear picture about the ways in which these different groups are affected. Where the data does exist, we see stark racial disparities, and we have spoken to this issue. I wish to recall the role of the UN High Commissioner as the coordinator of the International Decade for People of African Descent in this regard. This is a stream of work which has been very relevant of late. The recent tragic and unfortunately recurring events in the US with the killing of George Floyd and the global expressions of outrage and related protests led to an urgent debate in our Human Rights Council last week, strengthening our resolve to further intensify our collective efforts to tackle discrimination and structural racism as a means of achieving social cohesion. So while the pandemic has exposed a lot of problems, it's also created an opportunity. The challenge now is to build back better. This is a little bit of our slogan, but if we can see things more clearly, perhaps digging in deeper, then collectively with solidarity, we can ensure that lessons from this health crisis, but also from the human development crisis, can help us reconstruct more just and more resilient societies, unraveling often decades of systemic inequalities and injustice in order that we can really deliver on the promise of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. This requires that we embrace, that we find ways operationally of how to understand the indivisibility of human rights. It's not just about the right to health. It's also very much a connection to other economic and social rights, the right to work, the right to housing, the right to education, of course, the rights to a number of civil and political rights like freedom of expression, but freedom of assembly as well. As the ambassador mentioned, there have been some good examples as well. I mean, I think we have seen some countries really rise to the challenge, whether it is making information available in the Roma language, for example, through dedicated websites in some countries, allowing financial resources for the provision of medical supplies and equipment in Roma communities where it's relevant. Other countries have granted residency rights to all migrants and asylum seekers to make sure that they are covered by health benefits in case of the outbreak escalating. Canada, for example, announced specific support for Indigenous people, including measures to address food insecurity and subsidies. Many states have tried to compensate for the loss of income, supplementing wages, understanding fixed sum compensation to employees, many of whom come from these less privileged communities. In Russia, there were bonuses for health workers and employees of second and tertiary care hospitals, where there was involvement with the emergency response. In Spain, measures included moratoriums on mortgage payments. In Belgium, the ban on house evictions in the Brussels region was extended until the end of August. So I think we have a sense of coping mechanisms that have tried to cover a range of communities and within that of constituencies who might be especially impacted. Your Excellencies, in all of this, parliamentarians have a unique role and the ability to bring a human rights and anti-discrimination lens into their multidisciplinary analyses of policies and proposed legislation, so that we can all work to ensure measures that do not disadvantage or discriminate against certain groups. And the recommendations of international human rights mechanisms, including the Universal Periodic Review, may assist in these efforts, helping us to counter populist appeals, to promote multiculturalism, to understand what it means for the most vulnerable and the most marginalized communities and groups. In recent years, many OSCE participating states extended generous efforts to receive high numbers of asylum seekers and refugees. And it is very important that these people in this context do not feel deprived of equal access to healthcare. I think obviously this is a linchpin of where we are at the moment in order that we can help to avoid stigma and manifestations of continuing the strong xenophobic and racist discourse. Effective policies for recovery can only be developed with the full engagement of all those affected. I think this is one of the themes of this dialogue, but I think this emphasis of how we can create participation that is truly genuine, that is truly inclusive, particularly of those who are affected and those who are usually not around the table when the decision-making comes. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has produced guidelines on participation at the request of our Council, and we provide there very practical guidance on how to ensure inclusive participation, and again, something that I believe parliamentarians are uniquely equipped to advocate for and work to encourage. So obviously this is an incredibly timely dialogue. I trust that we can continue to keep an open mind and an open spirit around all kinds of intolerances, around the COVID-related biases and misperceptions. I think the human rights system relies on you as pillars with our national human rights institutions, with our parliamentary structures, of course, even at the local level, local governance authorities, to push back against anti-rights populism, speak out against hate speech and other polarizing practices, all of which serve to corrode practices. We know this is going to be a long haul. I think by all estimates, this is going to be 2 or 3 years more of a very, very sharp unraveling of economic achievement. And I think with a view to achieving stable and resilient societies, we look forward to working with you more and better in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Al-Nashif. That was very interesting to hear from you. Thank you to both of our guest speakers for a very useful and I think interesting introduction to the topic. I think the scale of the challenge faced now seems really quite clear. So I'm really pleased that we have the opportunity today to discuss the topic and ensure it remains high on the agenda. It's also been useful to hear some of the recommendations and the positive examples that have been noted by our 2 speakers. So thank you also for that. With that, we have already taken note of a number of requests for the floor, and if anybody else has a request to intervene, please do note that in the WebEx chat function. To the degree possible, we ask that you please keep your remarks to within 3 minutes. That'll make sure that everybody has an opportunity to intervene. With that, I will then immediately go to Senator Ben Cardin from the United States, former Vice President of our Assembly, and he also serves as the Assembly's Special Representative on Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Intolerance. Thank you, Senator Cardin.
Well, first, thank you very much. And on behalf of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, let me start by thanking the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's leadership and the Secretariat for organizing this and the previous webinars on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on issues of traditional concern of the OSCE. I also want to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise and inspiring us to consider today's topic, the impact of the pandemic may have on diverse societies where social cohesion may already been challenged by intolerance, discrimination, extreme nationalism, and hate. As this body's special representative on anti-Semitism and racism, I have been alarmed by the attacks on people who have been scapegoated for this virus. Parliamentarians should lead by example in countering disinformation, conspiracy theories, and other propaganda that stoke anti-Asian bigotry, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Roma, and other forms of racism. This is especially important given that minority and immigrant communities have been shown to be more vulnerable to the impact of the pandemic, in part due to past inequities that are compounded by inadequate healthcare and economic responses. COVID caused disruption in education, and it may also have a long-term disproportionate consequence for those already impacted by discriminatory schooling. As parliamentarians, we have a responsibility to ensure that the measures we introduce and which our government implements are consistent with the OSCE standards on human rights and democracy including the 1991 Moscow Documents commitment regarding state of emergency. It's also vital that our parliamentarians oversight the extent of the use of military authorities in policing, which may have the potential to worsen relationships with minority communities and erode public confidence in government at a time when the trust is critical for the effective implementation of responses to this virus. At this time, America is grieving over the brutal and unnecessary death of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th. Both state and federal law enforcement officers are moving quickly to bring the police officers, in this case, to justice and hold them accountable for their actions, as Mr. Floyd's cry, "I can't breathe," went unanswered. As leaders, we cannot stay silent about George Floyd's death. Black lives matter. George Floyd was a father, a son, a brother. His life mattered. He did not need to die. As global protests have shown, many other Black men and women and others have died at the hands of law enforcement or vigilante civilians due to the color of their skin. They all deserve justice. Reforms to policing are needed throughout the OSCE region. This is one of the top priorities we identified as your special representative before COVID-19. I've introduced the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act and the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act to reform police departments in America and rebuild trust between police officers and the communities they are sworn to protect and serve. COVID-19 will undoubtedly lead to profound changes in all of our countries that will unfold for a long time to come. I thank you and my colleagues here today for the work you are doing to ensure that we meet a global crisis with global cooperation faithful to the commitments we have undertaken within the OSCE. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. I will now give the floor to Vice President Kari Henriksen from Norway, who also serves as the Assembly's rapporteur in the Human Rights Committee. Ms. Henriksen, please.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And thank you to the speakers for their interesting remarks, and also to Senator Cardin for his precise words about a very important issue. And as we continue to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, it is evident that these difficult times have placed a lot of pressure on our societies. It is regrettable to observe that this pressure has manifested itself in an alarming upsurge of racism and discrimination against certain groups. As parliamentarians, we must be vocal on this issue and repeat our condemnation of such displays of hate. We cannot allow this current crisis to weaken the fabric of our societies, which are at their core based on the respect and protection of the dignity and human rights for all. The crisis has, as Ambassador Sanya said, revealed the weakness and the bad governance and systematic racism that exists in greater or lesser extent in most of our countries. At the same time, we need to recognize one positive outcome which has emerged from the current crisis, as we are witnessing people around the world banding together to demand equality and respect for all in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. This grassroots movement and wave of protests highlight the terrible consequences of intolerance and discrimination, and how much these issues can impact social cohesion and stability when they are not adequately cared for. These protests have also been a powerful demonstration that civil society is an essential and powerful actor in democratic life. Our work as parliamentarians often relies on the voices and expertise of engaged citizens. It is therefore our duty to respect and strengthen the voices of minorities and of civil society, as well as to ensure that the response to the protests is respectful of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We must also rise to the challenge presented by this movement and work together to find ways to enable people to safely make their voices heard on the streets during the ongoing health crisis we are still experiencing. I believe this can be achieved through transparency and dialogue. In Norway, we have concerns regarding women and children exposed to violence and negative social control in their families. They lose their opportunities to attend ordinary activities at sports, leisure activities, meeting and socializing with other adults and other children, which could help them to raise awareness and to alarm about their situation. And I think that this happens in many, many countries, as also has been addressed from the earlier speakers today. Colleagues, I invite you to consider this international movement for civil rights not only as a challenge, but as an opportunity for profound, constructive dialogue and positive change, as an opportunity to build more inclusive and responsive societies. The way we respond to today's movement will impact what our societies are tomorrow. And that is one of our core options to raise this issue in public and in our own parliaments. I am thankful for our two distinguished speakers for taking the time to join us today, and I appreciate the insight that you have shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Henriksson. I will then ask Ms. Grigoryan from Armenia. You have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you.
We hear you well.
Thanks a lot. Dear colleagues, as I have newly joined the OSCE PA delegation from Armenia, I want to greet everyone and thank everyone for your continuous work, especially during these complex times. I want to mention and continue what Ms. Henriksson said, but also before Senator Cardin, and say that we indeed do need to take this challenge much more as an opportunity. We need to face the challenges, but at the same time, take this much more as an opportunity to really show our solidarity across various societies. And George Floyd's life showed that the cohesion and taking this challenge as an opportunity is possible. Speaking about Armenia in the context of this webinar, and the national and ethnic minorities and the challenges they face, first is to state that actually Armenia is one of the very homogeneous modern societies where the 11 national and ethnic minorities together comprise less than 2% of the total population. It is with confidence that we state that neither during the lockdown nor afterwards have there been any xenophobic expressions towards the minority groups. And this is in fact clearly showing the absolute absence of discriminating attitude or intolerance towards the minorities residing in Armenia. As we discussed during the preceding sessions, COVID-19 crisis indeed intensifies many of the issues that already do exist in various societies. And again, in this regard, we can see that this observation is very much true. At the same time, now, this observation is also valid when we speak about issues that do exist, namely the disproportionate concentration of low-skilled labor, unregistered jobs, or in other words, the informal economy, etc. And here is where the programs initiated and implemented by the Armenian government to address the social and economic impact of the pandemic address the needs of all affected groups. Being fully inclusive and non-discriminating, in fact, these programs positively targeted the minorities in several aspects. The number of children in the families of ethnic minorities is well above the average in Armenia, and one of the social programs was aimed at providing one-time financial support to families calculated per child. Another economic program was designed to support agricultural activities, and several others were providing, again, social funding to workers of affected fields of economy. Turning to another aspect, accessibility of various materials regarding the healthcare during the pandemic and official responses again. I'm proud to highlight that the Ombudsman's Office has prepared translations for the guidelines, leaflets, as well as the report on the new coronavirus and human rights.
I'm sorry, there's something, your microphone seems to be going in and out. If you could please try again.
Sorry?
just very briefly, could you be covering the microphone possibly with something? I don't know.
Should I bring it closer? Is it better now if I speak a bit louder?
Try and speak a bit louder, please.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. So turning to another aspect, the accessibility of various materials.
Sorry, we can barely hear you now.
I'll be trying.
Okay. No, nothing. Maybe if it's okay, we'll move to the next speaker. We can perhaps come back to you later if there's an issue there. I'm sorry about this. In that case, I'll ask. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll ask Dr. Fry from Canada, who's also the Assembly's special representative on gender issues. Please, Dr. Fry.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and hello, everyone. And I want to say how proud I am of the work that the OSCE has been doing during this COVID-19 crisis in responding to all of the multifactorial issues that are popping up and dealing with each one of them in an in-depth manner. So I must say, I am pleased to be on this particular one. Well, some of the things that COVID-19 has done is to expose all the cracks in our social infrastructure. And in Canada, it's done that in spades. And I think we always thought that because we had universal healthcare where everyone, including immigrants and refugees, all had access to healthcare, that we were fine. But what we saw was that this exposed in some communities, Black communities, and in Indigenous communities, specifically in Canada, and in East Asian countries, that there was racism beginning again, I think, as a result of what Ben talked about and what's happening in the United States. People here in Canada began to say, well, hello, let's look at how Black communities are doing in Canada. And then Indigenous communities, we know, have the lowest health outcomes in Canada. They have the highest rates of suicide. They have poor housing. They are actually in the lowest socioeconomic group, and they are incarcerated in greater numbers than their demographic warrants. But I think what we have tried to do is, as these things show themselves, all of these bits of racism and xenophobia, because I think when a crisis occurs, people feel very powerless. And immediately that they feel powerless, they look around for somebody to blame. And then, of course, they find a group, and that group has to be those who are different. And therefore, they pick up that and they blame it. And you see that in Canada, we've seen anti-Asian, anti-East Asian violence in a great way. But I think some of the things we have now seen is that the increase in violence against Indigenous communities by institutions. What we have unearthed is systemic violence. And while we have done things in Canada to stop the cracks and to cover them over during the COVID emergency, we need to talk about how we deal with systemic change. To stop this from happening in the long term and to identify problems. And the first thing I think we need to do is to start to get disaggregated data based on ethnicity, race, religion, color, language in Canada. We need to look at all this, Indigenous status, gender, LGBTQ status. And so we're finding that if we start breaking that down and getting health data, and Statistics Canada has decided starting in July, on July the 1st, they will begin to collect that data with regard to health. We will find that, in fact, these communities, because they live in poverty, and we know that healthcare is defined by socioeconomic status, it's defined by race, it's defined by where you live, especially in a massive country like Canada. People living in remote areas have difficult problems. And so we need to pull that together to take the data, check and see who are suffering the most economically, socially, politically, and in healthcare issues. And then when we get that data, we can find out why are these people so far behind? Why are certain groups this way? What are the challenges they face? And then start to bring about policies and programs to help these communities to actually overcome those challenges and integrate fully into society in all of the ways that they need to. So I just wanted to say that. I was saying that in Canada, we have moved up the ladder to stop the systemic problems, but it's only for the short term. And we need to do this long term creates social cohesion. Citizenship makes Canadians feel they belong. And that's something that I think we need to think about. And as people believe they belong, they will want to do what's best for their country. And of course, the country's progress will be their progress. So there is a sense of belonging that we need to instill, which you might call social cohesion, but a sense of belonging to the whole and to not be different and other anymore. So thanks very much for allowing me to put my 2 bits in.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. And good morning also to you far away there. I'll now pass the floor to Ms. Agayeva from Azerbaijan, please. Ms. Agayeva, are you there? I think your microphone is maybe off. Can you please unmute?
Okay, sorry.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, I'm greeting all of you. First of all, I would also like to welcome our expert guests, Ambassador Lamberto Zanyer and Nada Al-Nashif, and thanks for presenting an extremely detailed and informative remarks regarding this important topic. Unfortunately, in a surprisingly significant number of countries, we are witnessing minorities are being increasingly blamed, if not for the origins of the virus, but at least for the continuation of spreading the virus. Of course, this in turn leads to the fact that some minorities being feared and targeted by more and more hate speech and unfortunately even acts of physical life-threatening violence. It's a clear violation of human rights of those who are most vulnerable, particularly migrants, refugees, those forcibly displaced, the millions of stateless people. There are so many factors that those people are becoming victims of various manifestations of hate or bias-based discourse in connection with COVID-19. First example, entrenched inequality, when minorities may not have or have a little access to healthcare services or to medical testing to identify the virus. Another example is that they are not or very little provided with the accurate and balanced information in their own language, so that they can be properly informed on the measures to protect the members of their community or family members. This situation is quite alarming, as most of them are not having an access to the most basic forms of protections they need. And obviously, it's not a secret that virus can explode in these severe conditions. Other than that, as discussed, the virus exacerbates xenophobia, hate speech, and scapegoating of certain communities. And by the way, I have to mention that Azerbaijan is among rare countries where different ethnic groups and faces have lived side by side peacefully for centuries. Azerbaijani NGOs in turn engaged actively at raising the public's awareness regarding xenophobia, racism, and hate speech towards vulnerable populations. I think we as parliamentarians should first of all express our profound concern about all forms of racism and racial discrimination and adopt a common strategy or new action plans to address emerging forms of COVID-19, racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Implementing and enforcing appropriate and effective legislative, judicial, and administrative measures will definitely contribute to the prevention of human rights violations. So I guess my 3 minutes are up and I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention and I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll be moving on, but I just wanted to quickly note, Ms. Al-Nashif, I understand you do have to leave, so thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it, and it was a very useful intervention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll then move on and give the floor to Vice President Sederfeld from Sweden, who's also acting chair of the Assembly's Ad Hoc Committee on Migration. Please, Ms. Sederfeld.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. And I would also like to say thank you to the distinguished speakers, as well as for my colleagues who have intervened in this debate. Last Friday, did the House of Lords hold a very interesting web meeting on refugees, and particular on the unaccompanied minors, who are the most vulnerable person when it comes to the refugees. And I think we as parliamentarians can do a lot to assist them. It's of course for the relocation responsibilities, but it's as well for healthcare, for education. As we know, it's crucial for the young people. And I would like also to announce here that we will, from the committee, meet in a few days with the Director General, Ms. Monique Perriat from the EU Commission, and discuss with her about the new legislation from the European Parliament about particular the unaccompanied minors, and as well as the securing of the EU external borders as a new part. And we will as well have a meeting with the Director General, Mr. Paraskeviciu, and have a further discussion on the Syrian refugee crisis, as it's still a very important issue and a lot of people suffer a lot. And we will discuss as well the humanitarian situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the situation in Greece. And I must say, it's there is still, even if we have the COVID-19 crisis and it affects all of us, but there are still other crises going on that's not affected by or have its original in the COVID-19. And we shouldn't forget this issue. We must continue our very important work that we had before and we have today, and not forget those who are the most vulnerable person. And we as parliamentarians, it has been said here earlier, we can do a lot. And it's our responsibility to act, because there is nobody else who can do this. We have to push our governments in front of us, and we have to raise our voice every time there is some kind of unjust going on. Who should do it otherwise if we who are elected doesn't do so? And I stop with this. Thank you, Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sederfeld. We come back to Ms. Grigorian, and we see if your microphone, if the audio is better. Please unmute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, wonderful. So just to finish with another important aspect, to mention another important aspect, and to finish my intervention, this is actually the accessibility of various materials regarding the healthcare during the pandemic and official responses. And again, here I'm proud to highlight the Ombudsman's Office work. They have prepared translations for the guidelines, leaflets, as well as the report on the new coronavirus and the human rights during the state of emergency into the languages of the minorities, national and ethnic minorities residing in Armenia, namely into Russian, into Kurdish, Yazidi, Assyrian, Persian, Farsi, and Indian. And with all the above said about my country, I still want to express and join my colleagues in expressing concerns about the unacceptable developments in various parts of the world in forms of xenophobia and discrimination, and confirm and reconfirm that we all should take joint effort in fighting and neutralizing any such expression, as we're all human, as we're all in the same boat. And let's, again, as much difficult as it may sound, take this challenge as an opportunity, and we can already see that this works. So let's go ahead with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to Ms. Doris Barnett, who's the head of the delegation from Germany and also serves as the chair of the Assembly's Second Committee on Economic and Environmental Affairs. Ms. Barnett, please.
Oh, and I want you to be all when we are meeting now, and hopefully nobody of your delegation is ill. I want to put your view to another aspect of the COVID incident that we have now, and this is working places. We all have in our countries working places where we hire people for little money. And this, for instance, in Germany right now, a big scandal at the slaughterhouses, where we slaughter our wines and cows for and whatever for very cheap prices, get very cheap our discount stores and places. And of course, people were very close to each other. We hire them from countries like Romania, Bulgaria. We pay them little money. Not we as a country, but the enterprises pay little money. And therefore, the virus right now spread it just like crazy. And why is it? Is also a problem we have within our OSCE area, because we all want to earn a lot, pay and pay a little for goods. So we really have to rethink, to reorganize our economy and watch our worker protection laws, that they are in place and people are safe where they are working. I don't know how it is in your countries, but right now we are so strict and very strong in our as a parliament and our government want to put in even stricter laws to prohibit such working conditions that we have right now. COVID pandemic also shows us weaknesses in our societies that, well, wouldn't think and wouldn't really look closely if it wouldn't happen right now within this huge company. More than 1,000 people are working, and more or less all got the virus. And of course, they spread it now, and this is a hotspot. And it's like I said, it's a big problem, and we will go in there very strong to prohibit that it will happen again. So working places where people for little money work and are working too close to each other, or things can happen too, but it shows that the working protection law must be installed properly in every country, in every enterprise. So this would be another aspect we think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Barnett. We'll now go back across the Atlantic, and I give the floor to Representative Vesey from the United States, please. Mr. Vesey, are you available?
Yes. Hold on one second. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you very well.
Okay, how about the visual, or can you see me?
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, let me start off by saying I really want to thank the leadership for hosting this webinar on the impact of COVID-19 and especially talking about it worldwide. This is actually my first interaction with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, so I'm really excited about this. For those of you that don't know me, I represent the 33rd Congressional District, which is a part of Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas. And we actually hosted a roundtable where we talked about election observation. And I'm the co-chair of the chair of the Voting Rights Caucus in the United States Congress. And so for me, getting an opportunity to talk about that, particularly because that is such a worldwide issue, it was very exciting for me. And so let me start first of all by saying that one of the things that we're facing here, and this is going to have an impact on elections, obviously, is COVID-19 in our country is disproportionately killing African-American and Latino populations at a much higher rate than other populations. Just to give you an example of that, and I'm going to include the Native American communities in that as well. In New Mexico, about 60% of the COVID cases are Native American populations, but only about 9% of the New Mexico population is Native American. And we're seeing that again with other ethnic groups, including African American and Latino, all across the country. This is a legacy of pre-pandemic realities, coupled with the fact that these populations make up a disproportionate share of frontline workers. So many of oftentimes when we talk about hospitals and people that work in a healthcare setting, we think of doctors and nurses, but people have to remember that there's a whole other litany of occupations and hospitals that are LVNs, people who assist nurses, orderlies, people who clean up hospitals, people that work and serve food in hospitals. And usually in the United States, most of these people are usually minorities. And to address this structural discrimination that has limited the health and wealth for people of color and leaving them especially vulnerable to COVID-19, I've worked with my colleagues in Congress to call for targeted health responses for our diverse communities and to focus on trying to address long-standing racism and its continued impact as we're seeing it again just so acutely here with COVID-19. I recently introduced legislation to expand internet access to low-income and diverse communities during the pandemic to ensure that all students can have online schooling. And the school district that my son is in here, which is an urban district in Fort Worth, they've done a good job of making sure that all kids have hotspots. But we want to make sure that all young people have that right to do that. Again, I also talked a little bit about me being the co-chair of the Voting Rights Caucus. We know that a part of being able to advance what we believe is a free society here in America is by having open elections. We are concerned that the pandemic is going to put the populations that I just talked about a second ago, Native American, Hispanic, African American, we're afraid that it will put them at more risk. And so we're going to be trying to do everything we can to give people the opportunity to vote by mail across the country. Some states already allow people to vote by mail regardless of age. But in states like mine in Texas, if you're not 65 or older or disabled, you're not allowed to vote by mail unless you're traveling and you're going to be outside of the county in which you reside. And so we want to make sure that we too, as we observe elections around the country as part of Helsinki and Americans do in general, like our former president, Jimmy Carter, we want to make sure that we are doing everything that we can possibly do to make sure that our own citizens have the right to vote. And of course, I'm going to continue working with Alcee Hastings, the former president of this body, on legislation that will require strategic diversity plans for every agency and all branches of the U.S. government, as well as establish a leadership institute for transatlantic engagement to reinforce the tenets of democracy on both sides of the Atlantic with a focus on inclusion. These are measures that will assist in preserving justice for all and continue to encourage cohesive societies for long-term stability of our democracy, and even looking beyond, obviously, the pandemic. And so I will turn the floor back over to Andres, but thank you very much for letting me have the opportunity to address everyone. And I hope that you are staying safe, that you're sheltered in place, practicing physical distancing, and trying to make the best of this unprecedented time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vici, and welcome to the Assembly. I'll now hand the floor over to Mr. Avci, the head of the delegation of Turkey. Mr. Avci, please. Please unmute your microphone.
Is it okay?
It's good.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all and all who organized this webinar. And I would like to thank the Ambassador and High Commissioner for their presentations also, and to you for your coordination. While determining measures to respond to the pandemic, Turkey has adopted human rights-oriented policies. We strive to protect the rights of all our citizens and asylum seekers, refugees present in our country without discrimination. As you all know, we are hosting 3.6 million refugees, asylum seekers in Turkey. Since the beginning of the Syrian crisis, we are hosting 3.6 million vulnerable Syrian, Afghan, and Iraqi asylum seekers. And half of them are, more than half of them are women. And 1,100,000 of them are under 17. So we have a vulnerable minority, which has a population more than some of the members of the OSCE. All our institutions and facilities are mobilized for their help, first and foremost for the protection of the right of life. Unfortunately, as mentioned before, racism, xenophobia, hate speech, and Islamophobia are on a disturbing rise throughout the world. They threaten our common democratic values, as well as the peace and harmony of our societies. This situation, which we witnessed before and during the pandemic, harms social cohesion. We try to actively contribute to international efforts to combat racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, in particular within the United Nations, OSCE, and Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Our government, while taking the necessary steps to protect public health, also extends a helping hand to other countries. In line with this understanding, medical and emergency assistance has been delivered to over 100 countries without any discrimination of language, religion, race, and geographical location. We always stress the need to protect vulnerable communities, especially migrants and refugees, and support for major refugee and migrant hosting countries. We have done our best for refugees, especially for vulnerable groups. But unfortunately, international community showed very little support on this issue. Our calls for fair burden and responsibility sharing mostly were ignored by international community. COVID-19 pandemic will have a long-term impact not only on health, but also on economic and social spheres. The global fight against COVID-19 outbreak can only be successful if it is carried out on the basis of international cooperation, solidarity, and inclusiveness in all areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Avci. We've made very good time. For the moment, we only have one other person who signed up to intervene. That's Vice President Bowness. So I'll give the floor to you, Ms. Vice President Bowness now. After that, unless there's anybody else who would like to speak, we'll just move to any conclusions or responses after that. Vice President Bowness, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Andreas, and good afternoon to everybody. I sought the floor to actually put a question, but may I make two comments on previous contributions? The first to Representative Vesey. I'm interested to hear about his campaign to extend postal voting. May I just beg him to consult the Electoral Commission in the United Kingdom when he goes forward with this, because he may find that, as we have, that postal voting gives rise to more problems with fraudulent voting than anything else. And secondly, to my friend Mrs. Barnett and her comments about cheap labour in abattoirs, I think that's a very big programme, and I understand precisely what she's saying, and I'm not disagreeing with her. But actually, there's also the much bigger question of cheap food and how we treat animals and our agricultural processes. But having probably perhaps should not have done, but picked up those 2 points from previous contributions, may I pose the question to Ambassador Zanier, and that is this, that in webinars such as this, we hear a great deal about our concerns and what individual nations are doing. And we hear from Ambassador Zanier that there are a number of worrying trends, all of which I agree with, and I'm sure it's correct. My question is, are we going to pull all these together so that we have a report which can come probably to the Permanent Council of OSCE, but also to the Parliamentary Assembly, making quite clear where the problems lie? And in this regard, we will not have to be afraid of naming individual countries. If we don't follow this through and merely talk about the good works that we would like to see done, we will not make any progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowness. I will now, I understand Secretary General Montella would just like to respond to the comments of the head of the Turkish delegation. Please.
I just wanted to, you hear me? I just wanted to thank Mr. Archie for this intervention, also because this Parliamentary Assembly was indeed involved into visiting the refugee camps in San Yurfa back in 2012 and also in 2015 with a big delegation. We've seen the efforts that the Turkish government has done in that region. Actually, after 2012, and to reinforce his message here, the then president, Riccardo Migliori, wrote a letter to the speakers and the foreign ministers of 57 participating states after what we saw in the San Yurfa, and after what we saw on how the Turkish government was dealing with the refugees. I mean, they actually never called them refugees, they always called them our Syrian guests, which was for us quite a learning exercise. But in that letter, President Migliori, of course, appeals to governments and to parliaments to help the Turkish government, who, as I can understand, has spent around 40 billion euros of its own budget to deal with this situation. And I think Europe has responded with a 6 billion grant from the EU, or 3 billion, I can say, yes. Your hand. So these are the figures. I mean, I don't have a big comment to make. I just wanted to say that the PA was present. The PA has done as much as it can within its perimeter, which is going to see with its own eyes, expressing solidarity there on the ground, and then coming back home and addressing speakers, addressing foreign ministers. It was mentioned in one of our president's speech at the ministerial meeting, this issue. But this is as much as we managed to do. So indeed, the international community sometimes should be able to do better than what we're doing. So thank you very much for your intervention, Mr. Archie.
Thank you, Roberto. Unless there are any further requests to intervene, I would now ask High Commissioner Zanier if you'd like to respond to anything that has been raised or expand on anything otherwise said. Please, Ambassador Zanier.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a series of points and reacting to various comments. Let me run through them. And I will start from the point, very relevant point raised by Lord Bowness. The issue of a report and the issue of trying to see in a more systematic manner what is happening. We have a problem starting already mapping out what is the situation, because we don't have enough data. We don't have, as you heard also from the Deputy High Commissioner of Human Rights, many countries don't issue the disaggregated data. And so it is difficult to understand and to have concrete beyond what is the impression and the media reports, but to have an exact picture of the situation when it comes to understanding how vulnerable groups are affected, to what extent they're affected, in which areas, and what are the responses. So what I'm planning to do from my side, as I mentioned to you, I'm planning a webinar in a week's time or so with OSCE participating states. And I would use it also to launch a questionnaire to each country with a number of rather precise questions that should give us the basis, at least the facts that we need to start assessing the situation and assessing with more accuracy what is the extent of the problem. It's a very complex. Even a questionnaire is not easy to put together. Just the questions, it's not easy to put together, and you would have to see the answers then. But then, of course, there's another little problem from my perspective, which is that some countries may object to the fact that I may be addressing also groups that are not formally national minorities. But in fact, this has to do with diversity in the society and how diversity is handled in the context of a crisis. So we should go a bit broader than just the traditional minorities. So let's see how countries react, and maybe you parliamentarians can push governments also to be more open, more transparent, and so that there is more awareness. Also, sometimes governments don't really focus so much on this. So for me, the first objective is really to push them to understand the problem, and to, once it's acknowledged, also to push them to start, addressing it with measures that can be administrative nature, or in some cases we might even need legislative steps. So certainly, yes, it needs to be done. I want to avoid, though, a report based on information getting from field operations that would be, as usual in the OSCE, imbalanced. That would be addressing only some countries and forgetting others, where I see the problem affecting in different ways, but affecting basically everybody in the OSCE area. So I would really aim for something that is inclusive and that addresses every angle of the problem. So the data is the starting point of this, and we'll have to come to terms with that. The second small comment I wanted to just to add in the discussion, because we didn't touch it on it at all. There's still an issue of statelessness in the OSCE, and there are stateless people here and there. And something we have seen is that stateless people, because they don't have access to documents, registration, etc., they're forgotten, and they are among the most penalized groups here. Of course, I'm encouraging countries. I'm working with UNHCR on this to make steps towards the goal of ending statelessness worldwide by 2024. So it would be good to keep countries, to keep pushing countries to do that, and that would automatically also eliminate this problem. But this is an angle that should be kept in mind. The stateless people sometimes are forgotten, and they are suffering. The other point I want to raise is policing. In 2006, so 14 years ago, but next year will be the 15th anniversary. We will mark, in fact, this anniversary. We issued recommendations on policing in multi-ethnic societies. And these recommendations are saying that as societies are becoming more diverse, also, first of all, the composition of the police should reflect the diversity of the society. And then as police operates in multi-ethnic environments, it should be adequately trained. There should be, how can I say, an awareness the use of force can be problematic. So the role of the police would be, first of all, to try to encourage dialogue and resolution of problems, and so a facilitating role, etc. And then there's also the concept that police that is truly multi-ethnic will be also more effective, because it will be credible and will be respected by all communities. So we've seen some good examples of this in the OSCE area, but also some less good examples, and there are problems. So we will need, how can I say, stronger support to encourage countries to listen to our recommendations and to implement them, because this will solve some of the problems that they face internally. I heard the statement by the Turkish representative. I'm fully aware of the big burden. If there is something that we can do once we can start traveling again, I'll be happy also to, from my angle, to engage, and maybe a visit or something to take a look at the situation and to talk about this, and to raise the profile also difficulties that Turkey is having itself and the investment they are making addressing this issue. Finally, the vote by mail, and on this is really more of an ODIHR issue. I'm happy to discuss it with the director of ODIHR. I see the point, however, that the pandemics, if there is a continuation of this, which of course we all hope that it will fade away pretty fast, but should this not be the case, or should it linger back, it might in fact affect electoral processes. It might hamper, as we and all governments issue recommendations to, on social distancing, on avoiding public gatherings and all that, election campaigns, and the whole process of preparation of the elections goes in the direction of bringing people together. So perhaps, and this is also something we can discuss with the Parliamentary Assembly, and maybe we could issue some kind of a statement asking governments to focus on this and to find maybe temporary measures for the duration of the COVID to make sure that the COVID doesn't really impact adversely on the elections by especially affecting negatively some groups, or the participation of some groups. What is the best method, whether it's mail or whether there are other ways, I don't know. But I'll be happy to join in if there is a sense that this might lead to discrimination within the society, within different groups of the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Zanier. I now want to ask if President Tsereteli would like to say a few words of conclusion before we part. We've made very good time today. President Tsereteli, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas, for your very effective facilitation. We are good in time. We heard very interesting interventions from our guest speakers, and particularly thankful to High Commissioner Zanier for his very right, let's say, priorities which he highlighted, because we know that in many aspects and many directions, almost everywhere, we saw that COVID and pandemic exacerbated problems. We had many times interaction and conversation with the High Commissioner and his officer. We knew that, and we know very well that before the COVID we had problems there. But now many things are more sharp, many things are, as I said, more exacerbated, and we all have this big concern. And especially for the people who are more vulnerable, and as COVID really deepened these existing inequalities in many regions, in our participating states. There have been also other issues today discussed, and I'm very much thankful to all our members who contributed. Especially, I was right to underline our transatlantic, let's say, ties, and the presence of Senator Cardin, and we welcome also the new congressman. He's new for this assembly, as I mentioned, Vizi, for very sincere and interesting comments. And now all of us, we are very much interested in what's happening in the United States, especially in the times of course, pandemic, but this protest there, and it's everything happening in times of election campaign. So thank you very much for flagging up the important issues, which we will try to, of course, follow. And there have been different, of course, interesting ideas, not only about the human rights. Human rights are at the core of all the events, but of course, in the economic sphere, and even in agriculture, and many other issues. But of course, we are all very much, focused how we parliamentarians can help marginalized groups, national minorities, other vulnerable groups. Because there are many, let's say, different reports all over the world that their plight is much more worse than it was even before the pandemic. For instance, the one was very last from UK that it says that the unequal impact of COVID on the different types of, let's say, minority communities that might be and may be explained by a number of different factors ranging from social, economic inequalities, races, discrimination, stigma, occupational risk, as Doris mentioned, and different inequalities in prevalence of conditions, even increase the severity of diseases including obesity, diabetes, hypertension, or asthma. So there are a number of different problems in front of us, and I think what Lord Bond said, and also there was a response from Lambert Bolzani very rightly, that yes, this is a work of parliamentarians. We don't have different instruments to punish individuals or to punish governments or to impose any sanctions, but we can, of course, indicate or say loudly that this government, this society is doing much more better in terms of minorities or inequality or human rights, and those are failing. And I think that's damage of reputation. It should be very important for any government or any country. So I think to be, let's say, on the spot and to discuss all those issues are very important, and we are doing that. And I'm very much thankful to all my colleagues here. I also welcome the new Armenian colleague and Belgium. During those months, a lot of great contributions, and it's not only words and not only statements, but people are working on their places and they're very actively leading and guiding sometimes all the societies to the better outcome. So we have to continue life, and I think we will defeat this COVID, but we have to defeat all the problems which emerged after this pandemic. So looking forward to continue our webinars on different topics, and thank you very much for your participation today.
Thank you very much, President Tsereteli. And thank you to all who contributed and participated. I hope the webinar has contributed to shedding some light on the challenges and of course making sure that this topic stays high on the agenda. I certainly think it'll continue to inspire discussion within the Assembly in this field in the coming months and years. I wish you all a good remaining day and hope that you're able to tune in again and participate in our next webinar scheduled on 30 June, next week on the 30th of June.
Goodbye.
Good morning, good evening.
All the best. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye.